Bonjour la classe, and welcome to the fifth episode of my French Revolution vlogcast. And today we've reached 1789. We're going to think about the events of the spring and summer of 1789, try and pin down exactly when it is that the revolution starts. Of course, the spring was dominated with preparations for the Estates General, which had been agreed to meet at the start of May. Now, the Estates General was a gathering that would include representatives of the first, second and third estate. And traditionally, the three estates had met with equal numbers. So there would be an equal number of nobility, clergy and third estate representatives. And they would get one vote each in any discussions and decisions that were to be made. And there were negotiations, quite heated negotiations, going on all the way through the preparations for the Estates General and up to the meeting of the Estates General to try and give the third estate more of a say, because they're hugely more numerous in the country. Jacques Necker tried to kind of fudge this issue in the run-up, and he said, well, the third estate can have twice as many representatives, which implied that they would have a much bigger say. But until, in fact, up to the meeting of the Estates General, he kept the voting system as one vote each, which meant that the third estate could always be outvoted 2-1. So right from the start, mistakes were made in the creation of the Estates General if you wanted to appease the people and reach a sort of big reforms, substantial reforms that were being made. The other mistake that was made was in the spring. The king asked representatives of the Estates General to bring with them a list of grievances, a cahier de doléances, from their regions that they'd been elected from. Incidentally, the elections to elect the third estate representatives were the most democratic elections of this whole revolutionary period. Actually, you'll find that the other elections that take place through the revolution, it gets progressively less democratic each time, but that's an aside really. The cahier would sound like a good idea, but it meant that that Louis would then be aware of what people were worried about or wanted to change. But the danger of it was that actually people began to think much more broadly than just tax reform and started to think of all the things that they wanted to change. And so if you read the Cahiers de Doléances, they really go into all sorts of things about people's lives and how they weren't great. And there are great cahiers that talk about the rabbits being a real problem around here, that they keep coming and eating our lettuces. And of course the third estate couldn't get rid of them because of the privileges of nobility, which meant that they alone could deal with rabbits or hunt rabbits. So the Cahiers broadened the issue, and by the time the Estates General actually met on May the 5th, there were high hopes, unrealistically high hopes. And you can see this because the establishment, the king and his advisors, are still running things exactly as they had been run before. So on the opening day of the Estates General, the third estate are gathered in their seats, in their plainish clothes, and the second and first estates parade in past them. And the third estate are meant to sort of stand up and see this parade of their elders and betters and submit to them and show sort of humbly accept their status before them. Added to which, the king and Jacques Necker both make speeches at the opening of the Estates General, and both of them fail to capture the mood. The king is kind of just uninspiring, and Necker actually talks for 3 hours in massive detail about the economic crisis facing France, to the extent that Louis XVI actually falls asleep during Necker's speech. So things get off to quite a sluggish start, and then they get caught up in negotiations about the voting system. Now that goes so badly that the third estate actually pull out and create their own assembly. And this is where the National Assembly comes from, that the third estate representatives at the Estates General decide that the Estates General no longer represents them, and they see themselves as the nation, partly as a result of Abbé Sieyès' famous pamphlet that he'd written in January 1789, where he said, what is the nation? It is the third estate. And they said, oh, we are the nation. We'll make ourselves the National Assembly. And they continue to meet as a National Assembly for some weeks. Eventually, of course, the king has to break the logjam, so he decides to call everyone back together in a special royal session that he's going to call. And to prepare for that, the palaces of Versailles are locked and shut so that they can clean up and get the throne ready. Nobody had told the National Assembly this was going to happen, and so they turn up one morning and they find that they can't go into their usual meeting place. They've been locked out. It's raining, which puts everyone in a bad mood. And so they find the only place they can find locally to meet, which is a tennis court, or perhaps a real tennis court, I think it is. And they get together there and they make this famous tennis court oath. This is on the 20th of June 1789, where they swear to each other that they will not stop meeting until a new constitution has been signed. Now that you could see as being the start of the revolution, and particularly if you think it's a bourgeois revolution driven by the kind of educated and more of the elite of the Third Estate, then you are likely to see this as being the start of the revolution. In the aftermath of that, Louis does call the estates back together, but he can't really break through. He's not prepared to move into any substantial reforms, quite modest proposals, and he actually gives up at that point and says, well, the first and second estate representatives might as well meet with the others, the third estate representatives, as part of the National Assembly. So that kind of closes off the first part of 1789, the first part of revolutionary activity. And then the focus shifts really to Paris. Now, we're kind of moving on to July now. July was the worst month for the peasants because the prices of bread rose to their highest of the year because it's furthest away from the previous year's harvest, and so shortages were at their greatest. In July, there were bread shortages, high prices. There was a rumour that aristocrats were hoarding bread, and amidst all this, Louis XVI sacked Jacques Necker, hero of the masses. It was at that stage that Camille Desmoulins very famously stood on a table in the courtyards of the Palais Royal and said to the gathered crowd, we've got to sort this out. We've got to defend ourselves against the king. He's gathering troops on the edge of Paris to come and restore order, which means to get rid of us, and we need to take matters into our own hands. As a result of that, the crowd kind of milled around Paris, not really knowing what to do. They started to take down the customs wall as a sign they were against the taxation regime. And then on the 13th of July, they formed a militia and went to the Hotel des Invalides to grab a load of weapons. Now, the problem was they had the weapons, but they had no ammunition. So that's what means on the 14th of July, they turn up to the Bastille and storm the Bastille in an attempt to secure for themselves gunpowder for their weapons, for their militia. It is this event that, if you think the revolution is driven by the Third Estate, by the people, by the sans-culottes, that you will see as being the start of the revolution. In the aftermath of the capture of Bastille, it's certainly a significant moment in the year. The National Assembly celebrate that Paris has been taken for the people, and they decamp to Paris. The President of the National Assembly, Bailly, is made Mayor of Paris. The Vice President of the National Assembly, Lafayette, is made head of the militia. And the following day, Louis XVI himself, having dismissed his troops and written a will, left his brother in charge at the palace, Louis XVI takes himself to Paris, wears a cockade, a rosette badge on his hat, and acknowledges the revolution, effectively giving up power to the revolution. In the summer, things trickle on. There's a lot of unrest in the country. The great fear amongst peasants is that Louis will order foreign troops to come in, and there are stories of people seeing clouds of dust on the hills and panicking and running off because they think the British troops are coming or the Spanish troops are coming, depending on what part of France they live in. And of course, there are attacks on the nobility and on their houses in some areas, and upon their privileges, of course, and that leads to many of the nobility, the wealthier members of whom actually were in favour of reform. They give up their rights in the August decrees. And so, just to recap, in 1789, you have both the Estates General and then the storming of the Bastille, the Tennis Court Oath in between. And earlier on, the bourgeoisie start the revolution. And I would argue that in July, the Third Estate, the sans-culotte forces of France, start their revolution. And right from the start, you can see both these groups wanting different things out of what is to come. And that, of course, causes the problems that are ahead. Thanks for listening. See you next time.